Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21 and Enfield Voices, and this is one of the many webinars that we do. And this is a webinar where we're going to interview a local author. And we've done that several times, and it's really good because we have a lot of really good local authors in our area, and they've all produced some really excellent books. And we've got Lynda Brennan with us today, and Lynda has produced a book that she'll tell you about in a minute, which I think is remarkable in the way it reflects the lives of families that I know she works with and many people work with. So welcome, Lynda, for this webinar today. And can I start by asking you briefly, or else it would take up the whole webinar, could you tell us something about yourself and your background?
Came from Lancashire, Lee Lancs. I came to London when I was 18 and I trained to be a teacher in drama. And that's what I did really for the next 30 years. Although some of that time I worked in pupil referral units and community centres like Jackson's Lane in Archway. So I got very involved in young people's theatre. When I retired, I went back to the drama and set up with another person, Tottenham Theatre, where we did a lot of devising plays with people who normally hadn't performed very much, and I still do some of that as well.
But you're also, aren't you? You're a political activist and you teach drama, as you said, and you're pretty busy all the time. So the question is, how did you find the time to write a novel?
Like a lot of people, I've written since I've been really young, but then always wanted to write properly, take it more seriously. So for me, it was a bit of a passion that I wanted to see if I could do it. After that, I made the time, but in fact, since retiring, I have had time, and it's amazing how you can make time if you want to. And apart from that, I just had a hut built for me in the garden, and that was the impetus to get going.
So you're a woman with a shed.
I'm a woman with a shed, a room of one's own, what Virginia would say.
Yeah, well, okay. So, I mean, you worked, as you said, as a drama teacher with young people, and you did that in Tottenham, I believe. And was it working with those young people that inspired you to tell a story? Because you didn't just want to write, did you? You had a story to tell.
This particular story was born of something different, which is with my husband and myself, we did foster for altogether over 2 years. He was the main foster carer. I was still working at the time. Also, he was the person that had the best qualities for it as well. It's a very tough job. I've got massive respect for foster carers, I have to say. But also, when I was teaching in Islington, I was the designated teacher for looked after children. And just after retirement, I did a lot of training. I trained with Islington Virtual School and trained the foster carers for a little while. So I've been interested but obviously I've got a lot of insights from that experience about children in the care system. The theatre bit was, yes, I worked at one point with young people in Tottenham, and what we did was based on their personal stories. So I am very interested in young people's stories. I'm telling them, yes.
Yeah, I know that you said that you think it's important that young people should tell their stories, and you've told this story, Looked After Boy. Now, without going into giving the game away too much, and very briefly, could you tell us what the plot of your book is?
It's about a young boy with 5 other siblings, and his name is Joe. He lives in Tottenham, and he suffers a lot of abuse from his father. the upshot of this is that all of the children are taken into care and they're all separated. And really, in many ways, the rest of the book is about how Joe, aged by then about 13 or 14, swears to get the siblings back together again. On his way to that, he finds himself homeless. He finds himself trying to face up to his own defects and his demons. And also, though, perhaps more importantly, gets involved with county lines, which, as people on this probably know, is something that, you know, deliberately goes out to lure and attract young, vulnerable boys in particular for drugs and so on. So that's the story, really.
So, I mean, it begins with Joe, who's a 13-year-old boy, and he's in a family where there's a cocktail of problems, and he faces them through this journey in your book. I mean, there's domestic abuse, there's a breakup of the family, there's going into care, there's drugs, county lines. And you write about it as if you know it intimately. I mean, how did you know about these problems intimately? Have you experienced it in your own life, or did you learn it from the people that you were working with in your drama classes in Tottenham?
Yeah, as I say, a lot of the drama I did base on personal story. I got very interested in doing the kind of drama where you make plays out of people's real experiences. I do think for children in care, telling their stories is a massive issue. The children in care have to keep what's called a life book, and it's this attempt by the social workers to try to keep the child in touch with their earlier life so that they can actually have a history and retrace it, their story, in other words. And I was trying to do this by use of theatre. We did obviously get huge the book is a fiction. It's a mixture of real children I have known. I've drawn upon my experience mainly in school. So I know that certainly some of these awful experiences that Joe goes through have a foundation in reality, certainly. And in particular, the splitting up of the children is an issue in social work today. I'm not a social worker, I'm a teacher, but I know that the issue of whether it's wise to split siblings up comes up again and again and again.
Yeah, let's come to that in a minute, because we could talk about the social worker Alice, because I think that's really interesting. But you just said it's important for people to tell their stories, and that was one of the problems with Joe, wasn't it? He couldn't tell his story. When the school teacher said to him, "Write the story of your life," emotionally he couldn't do it. And it's only when he sort of gets into trouble a great deal, and he goes back to Pete, the foster carer, who he trusts and who is very good, that he first tells his stories. And that's almost a transformation for him, isn't it? And is it your belief that storytelling is what can help transform people's lives?
It is. I think it's cathartic. And I think in the case, I was very interested. I use the term emerta, partly because I used to teach that view from the bridge a lot when I was teaching, and it's a feature in that. But I use the word emerta because in many ways it was like a vow of silence that the children had taken up. They did not say anything. They didn't talk about the abuse. It was a mutual bond they had between them. So for Joe, this not talking and the way he internalized that, as if he couldn't talk, he couldn't stand up he couldn't find his voice. So that's a hugely important part of the story, that at the age of 14, when his back was against the wall, he had to speak for his brother, in fact, but for all of them. And yes, I do believe that that's part of a therapeutic way, finding your voice and telling your story, of helping people, yes.
The fact that he couldn't tell his story starts right at the beginning, because he couldn't tell that his mother was being abused by his father, could he? And in fact, there's sort of a code of not telling, isn't there? And it runs through the book. And when Simon couldn't bear it any longer, Simon being Joe's older brother, he went and told about or reported the violence that the family was achieving. And Joe couldn't understand that for ages. He was angry at his brother. And, you know, is that something you've experienced with people? They just clam up, they won't tell people, they won't go to the authorities, they just stay there and suffer it.
Yeah, I think anyone who's worked with young people, anyone who's been a teacher certainly, will recognise Joe very easily. I mean, what I wanted to get was, in some ways, he was an invisible boy. It wasn't just that he couldn't find his own voice. It's that people actually fairly actively conspired so he wouldn't find his own voice. I think we've all taught in that situation where you've got the invisible child who then internalizes and thinks that he doesn't count, he doesn't matter. And this is very common amongst children who've had, all children who are vulnerable actually, but children who've been taken into care in traumatic situations. And it is a kind of trauma. The sister of Joe, she doesn't speak from her experiences at all. She actually goes mute to some degree. And that she's only a peripheral character. But this what I was trying to bring out with Joe is how he'd internalized that he really didn't matter. And I was trying to give him that voice.
And that was sort of reinforced by the way social services treated him, wasn't it? I mean, Alice is the social worker in your novel, and you get the feeling that you write about her as if she's concerned, but is under huge pressure. So she can't give the time that's needed, and she's always off to another meeting. So the family just drifts. I know you said to me earlier that you would like to have developed the character of Alice a lot more, but did you have some sympathy with her as a social worker, or did you want to illustrate the dysfunction of the system?
She changed enormously. I changed and changed, and this was my most ambivalent character, really. I didn't want to make her, you know, just the bad person, the antagonist. I felt that was completely unfair. So what I did do is put the constraints that were on her. So the reason that she didn't listen properly was because she was actually overworked. And but at the same time, I think and I don't want to be too critical of social work, because first of all, we can all make mistakes, both in social work and in teaching, and we do. And in a way, I think the whole key here is to keep developing, keep learning how not to. But so I'm not trying to set the social workers up as being that they did. Nevertheless, the system, both in education and social work and the police, works against looked after children. I mean, statistically, there's still enormous failures in the care system. And one's kind of worried about saying this because it affects people wanting to go into social work, and you don't want to say too much. Social workers in themselves didn't cause the problems. So it is a difficult one. I wish I developed her further. What I did try to do was, at the end, she did acknowledge that she had half heard Joe. She did just about acknowledge. And she also acknowledged that she was so pleased he was back in Tottenham. And that was actually a kind of sub-strand of it, was that having sent him miles away, he does return to Tottenham, and how important Tottenham is as a place for him. And to some degree, that was what he was fighting against, because they thought they were sending him to a much better place. And it turned out, of course, that where he wanted to be above anything was back home in Tottenham. And I wanted to make that as a kind of little strand running through it.
Yeah, I mean, in a way.
About social services, I just have one other thing to add. If it seems to me that the more authoritarian a team is, whether it's a social work team or an education team, it actually mitigates against the flow of people talking and acknowledging certain things. I mean, in teaching, there was an example of, there was a little terrible tragedy of a child, 5 years old, that died of neglect. And I was very interested in what happened at the school, because the young first-year teacher did actually report her concerns. It was from an authoritarian team. And there's no way a young teacher will go back a second time. And I just was trying to piece together with that awful case about what could have changed. And I think the least authoritarian a team could be, the better in this case. You need to be able to make mistakes, you need to be able to talk, you need to be able to muse and browse and chat to people to get it right.
Yeah, and the other problem is, I mean, we did a webinar last week about Hilary Cotton's book, Radical Help. And I mean, she was saying that many people, many families are dealt with, just one family with, she's seen it, by 20 agencies and 73 different personnel. They've got no time to build a relationship. They just take notes, and they're just in the process of containment. And in a way, you felt in your book that Alice was working to a template, not to a relationship. And it ended up with her splitting the family up, and they all went to different places. And Joe went to Pete, and Pete was quite essential in your story, wasn't he? Because he was the saving grace for Joe.
Yeah, he was. And he was interesting because it was his first time at fostering. He wasn't an experienced foster carer. He'd made the one vow to himself, which is that he wouldn't ask too many questions. And it sounds silly, but all of us professionals, all of us ask too many questions as if it's our right. And he, not being from that area, just sensed that Joe didn't want those kinds of questions, and he just waits. And yeah, I think that was the key for Joe, that he ran back to Pete, yes.
And Joe was Pete was the person who took Joe out into the night and looked up and showed him the stars and made him realize that there was life beyond his problems. And that was quite important. But what happened then was that Simon went missing, didn't he? And and Joe ran away from Pete because he wanted to find his brother. And that's when his trouble started, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I tried to make the relationship between Joe and Simon, of the older brother, of particular importance, because the two parents were in prison and the siblings were all split up. And Joe, perhaps more than any of the others, for him, it was the grief and the loss of losing not only his parents, but losing his siblings was enormous. And they all dealt with it in their different ways. But for him, he couldn't get over the fact that Simon had been the one to go to the police. And he blamed Simon for a long time. But then later, Simon and him became trapped by the county lines. And they started making kind of sacrifices for each other. So in a way, they saved each other. So it's also a story of two brothers, really. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very emotional sort of thing, just like the relationship with Joe and his younger brother Danny, who he actually slapped once, and he felt guilty about that for the rest of his life, in a way, his early life. But when he sort of went after Simon, he came back to Tottenham, didn't he? And he sort of saw him by accident as he was having breakfast, followed him to the house where he was living. And that's where you had the drug pushers. That's where you had the people there who really, really took over Joe as they had taken over Simon. And you really portrayed life in that situation very well. I mean, is that something you found out from the people that you worked with, did drama with, and so on?
I think did drama with. This is the part of the book I found the hardest to write, because I've not got first-hand experience. I think partly you just read about county lines in ever-increasing horror, really. And of course, they zoom in on boys like Joe. I think there's another thing. One of the issues about the book was who I was aiming it at, who I thought might be an audience. And it varied. I started off with much older teenagers, and then I went lower. But in going lower, I had the problem of, there was an issue, it's muted, but an issue of sexual abuse running through it, and particularly with the county lines, that Simon had been possibly abused in this way, not as part of the deal, really. A rent boy, in fact. And at the same time, I was thinking, you know, if you're 12, do you really want to read this? And I had real problems. I took things out, I put things back in, and so on. I had real issues with how to address, but I didn't want to lose it completely. I do think it's one of these stories that we just don't hear about boys that are abused in this way. Overwhelmingly, the boys that are trapped by these gangs have been in care. In fact, there's an overwhelming number. There's no place to go, and they had nowhere to turn to. I think that was the issue. They couldn't go back. They knew that they couldn't go back. They were stuck.
But what was really revealing, I think, in many ways, is how they were sort of treated by the drug pushers. I mean, Joe knocks at the door, finds Simon's there. Simon's trying to get him to go away. I don't want you to get caught up in this. It's terrible, because Simon had been beaten up and, as you say, been sexually abused. But you showed how the drug pushers did it exceptionally well. They did it first by kindness, didn't they? And they did it by blackmail, and then they used violence. I mean, that progress, so that the person, Joe, Simon, is so captured, they don't know what to do. They can't get out of it. That was a really tragic story, wasn't it?
I thought at the beginning, I wanted, Joe was alone, and he found one of the guys just sat and listened and made him lots of cups of tea, toast, and of course, and gave him something to wear. And of course, we can see from the story that this was exactly what Joe was lacking. Once he'd run away from the children's home, 200 miles away, this was what he craved. And this older man sitting down, talking to him, listening to him, was, you could see how he couldn't say no to it.
And eventually he did sort of say to Simon, "We've got to get the hell out of here. I mean, you know, this is just too much." And so they did. They went away. Simon disappeared, and Joe ran down to Tottenham and knocked on Pete's door, who gave him the chance to talk about his problems, as we said earlier. But then, of course, he had to call social workers, and social workers then brought the template back in, didn't they? And they said to Joe, "Sorry, you're going to have to go back that 200 miles to Warrington," where he didn't want to go, where he was unhappy, where there were no other children even that he could play with. That is something that you were trying to show very much, weren't you? That separation is not the way to do it.
Yeah, that separation is really not the way to do it. But I also wanted to show Alice's. This scene was probably the hardest on Alice, the chapter, because she does come across as, she's looking at the children's home brochure, and it's a glossy brochure. The children's home looks like a hotel, a 5-star hotel with horse riding, and she just doesn't hear that Joe would rather do anything else other than go back. And in fact, she packs him off back there because it does tick all the boxes. I mean, there's a little bit in there as well, which is that he was given a tutor. And in fact, he was taken out of school from early, before he got sent away. And what I was trying to say about the school thing was that Joe hadn't got special needs as such. He quite liked school. At school, but actually he was quite good at science, and he was quite keen on science. And I wanted to kind of make the point that schools have a responsibility in this too. And when he was sent off, he got a tutor, and it's kind of not the same for a 13-year-old boy. So I wanted to do that. And
when he came back to Pete, and the social worker sent him to Warrington. Then you got this really interesting twist at the end. He's on the way up to Warrington. He's in the car. He hears the news that his brother Simon is on Suicide Bridge and he might be jumping off. So he finds an excuse to get out of the car, runs away, runs to the bridge, saves Simon, finds a journalist and tells his story. And it's the telling of his story that sorted it, not people looking at this need, but the publicity. Didn't you find that sort of an amazing thing to say in your story?
I wanted somehow to deal with social media. I wanted it to get out. I'll be truthful, I had a different scene where he goes to a conference and talks to a lot of assembled bigwigs and social workers. Somebody said, that a lot of teenagers wouldn't be that interested in that. And I thought, well, how would they get this out? And of course, it is probably partly by social media. So I wanted to tap into this. I also wanted to make the point that the journalists at first didn't see it as a story because the older boy hadn't jumped. He was safe. He was on his way in an ambulance to hospital. So therefore, it wasn't a story. And again, it's trying to get to the stories, the real stories behind these statistics. Boy nearly jumped from, Archway Road Bridge. So I wanted to, I wanted to get it out, and I suppose social media made sense. It's interesting that I didn't make Joe the one who got it out the most. I made his two sisters the ones that really got into it. And of course, it went viral, and loads of other kids found Joe's story resonating with them.
Joe is quite a remarkable figure in your story, and he does save his brother. His story gets out, and you said other people need to know about it. But the tragedy is that many families don't have a Joe, do they? And they're sort of almost victims of the system. I mean, what have you got to say to them?
Well, I suppose the Lem Sisse has just popped into my head. You might have heard of him, poet who was adopted in actually quite near my hometown. Treated appallingly, hidden. They had the social services at the time hid a lot of information from him. And Lem Sisse, when he was middle-aged, really survived, I suppose, and has done an awful lot of work with young people and people in care and so on. And you can't use the word hope too stupidly, because it really is not about that. I do think, first of all the agencies that looked after children, we all need to change. I mean, schools need to do what they're doing in the best way, and then more beside. You mentioned relationships. An awful lot of this is about building strong relationships. We're all so busy in our professional lives that nobody has the time. Well, we have to change that. Again, social services, they are overworked, no question about it. But if we don't adopt some therapeutic sections into working with families like this, we won't succeed. I mean, I was just thinking the word trauma does come to mind, and unless we know about trauma and how to deal with trauma and how to develop those relationships, I think actually we're borne out by the statistic. It is actually going worse. And you could say the care system is out of control, with young people now set up to go miles away again, which the book deals with, but also they've gone, a lot of children now put in unregulated homes where no one gives them, Ofsted's not involved, they don't look into them very much, and so on. So I think it's not, I'd be very loath to say there's hope. What I would say, institutional hope, what I would say is anything that can be done to to tell the children's story, to talk to them, to keep talking to them, to spend time. It has to be the way ahead. It has to, the talking has to be a way ahead, that it's actually not there. Joe felt tremendous shame, not able to talk. I think that lifting that shame by skilled people is the name of it, of what has to happen.
Yeah, and the family got reunited. The mother, who was in prison, who was complicit but really wasn't, and that's another story, I guess, for another book. But you know, the family got reunited. They all sort of lived together, and you have this wonderful end to the story where, having lived together, Joe goes out late at night with Steph, his sister, and they get on the swings in a park, and they're swinging away, and they put their arms up like this, reaching for the stars, just like Joe had done when he's with Pete. Is that the message of hope that you wanted to end with?
Yeah, that is the message of hope. I mean, as he meets Pete, he gets more involved in the natural world. He sees herons, he knows birds, things that he'd never really looked at. And then he stars kind of run through the whole book, and it ends with that. In a way, it's a better message than sitting down and talking and analysing what went wrong between him and Steph. It's far better that they did this, and it was adventurous because it was midnight. It wasn't the normal thing. They should have been in bed, but there they were swinging, and it was joyous. So yes, I do. There is, I think it's, first of all, I think in children's literature, it's pretty important to have hope. But I think dealing with these, thinking about Joe, it was the hope in his case of bringing his family back together that pushed him. And the stars, and the beautiful stars, you know, that image of them swinging together, probably tried to encapsulate it. Yeah.
Well, you certainly did. Anyhow, we sort of got to the end of the 30 minutes now, and just to ask you, if anybody wanted to, you know, get the book or find out more about you or contact you, where do they go?
The book's on, well, I'll start with perhaps the main one. So we're in touch with All Good Bookshop in Turnpike Lane, that we are also, my Bounds Green Writers Group, we're working with Tim at All Good Bookshop, because in these difficult times, trying to help him keep it going, and he's supported me about this book a lot. Then there's a Troubadour who published it. There's Waterstones, W.H. Smith's, and Amazon, and it's Kindle as well.
Okay, well then, you know where to buy it.
People want to talk to me, they can email me, or I haven't got a website. Bounds Green Writers Group has got a website, so please use that for the moment.
Okay. Well, okay. So, you know, if people are interested, please buy it, because it is a fantastic book, and it takes you into a world that many of us don't normally experience in a very tragic and realistic and ending hopeful way. So I would recommend people read the book, and you read it very quickly and you'll want to read it again. So Lynda, thank you for, you know, taking part in this and telling us about your story and your book and your views about the care system, which I think is really, really important. So thank you for doing it. And we'll end this interview now.